I guess what I'm going to try to do here, for a start, please forgive my terrible spoken English. I'll do my best. What I want to try to do here is, we talked a little about the U.S. reality and the UE reality, and Quebec stands as kind of a middle ground, being from both European heritage and North American in culture. So one of the great examples of that possible potential hybridization that we have here in Quebec is actually in the construction industry. So I wanted to take this time. I'm going to try to be very short with that so we can have more time to discuss afterwards. I wanted to give an overview of what we have in Quebec since 1968, because the labor relations regime of the construction industry celebrates its 50th anniversary this year. So I won't come back to that. Professor Bellman already told you a lot about how construction works in terms of trade qualification and the kind of industrial structure that you have. We have the same in Quebec, so it's mostly small firms. It's just-in-time on-site productions, project-based production. The part-time is generalized. The average number of hours worked in 2017 was 1942 or something around that. I think it's for the more recent data is like 960, but it's always around that. So it's basically 6 months of work for the mean worker. In Quebec, independent contractors exist, but they account for only 15% of total employment in construction, which is a little less than in other provinces. Collective bargaining in Quebec's construction is somewhat different from what exists in the other Canadian provinces. The fact is that, as you may know, Quebec is a kind of a distinct society in the Canadian Federation, and I think particularly in terms of labor relations, one of the features of Quebec labor relations is having two labor traditions, which are very strong in the construction industry, but exist too in other parts of the world of work. So for construction industry, back in the 1880s, so late 19th century, the American building trade unions came from English Canada to organize locals for unions for the carpenters, the bricklayers, the pipe fitters. So most of our most ancient trade unions in the construction industry in Quebec, they go back to late 19th century. The fact is that in Quebec we have a large part of the working class that is French-speaking and Catholic. It's not as much the case today as it was 100 years ago, but it still is in part. But at the time, the large part of the workforce was Catholic, and the Catholic clergy didn't feel very good about the establishment of international unions in Quebec. So, like in other parts of the world, they formed Catholic unions, which were very strong in the construction industry starting in the 1910s. Up until the 1960s, there was a kind of a territorial division of labor representation in Quebec. The building trade unions being mostly active in Montreal and in the border of the southern province of Ontario, and the Catholic unions being active in smaller cities and rural areas. One of the contributions of the Catholic unions was a legal regime that comes from Europe, from France actually, which is the juridical extension or decree system that we adopted in 1934, which is a system by which you can extend some terms of employment contained in the collective bargaining agreement to other to the employees of other enterprises in the same sector or the same trade or profession in the same region. So back in 1934, one of the industry where the juridical extension system was the most effective was construction because of all the small employers. So employers and unions, Catholic unions in Quebec, formed joint committee in most of the regions of the province, and so we had effective union coverage in terms of labor conditions in the construction industry in every region. In the 60s, there was in Quebec what we call the Quiet Revolution, which was the expression we use for the modernization of the Quebec and development of our state, our provincial state. And there was at this time provincialization of the labor market, which led to a lot of labor conflicts. And it's in part to solve those conflicts between the Catholic unions and the international unions that we adopted in 1968 the Construction Industry Labor Relations Act. I'll jump to what it is right now because I don't have that much time. The system that we have right now is maybe the main remaining heritage of the church social corporatism in Quebec, since it's based on the decree system. So it's a province-wide multi-trade collective bargaining system that is industry-wide. We have a master agreement for all the construction industry, and we have 4 collective bargaining agreements in every 4 one in every 4 subsectors of the collective of the construction industry. So in the residential construction, industrial, institutional commercial, and public utility works and road building. The system is also multi-union, since we have the CNTU, which is the what is now the ancient Catholic unions, and 2 more unions coming from that, and the international unions on the other side that split it back in 1980. There was a split between the international unions and the national building trade unions. The responsibility for the administration and enforcement of the agreements is given to what we call the Construction Commission. In the Construction Commission, we have a labor inspectorate that covers all the territory of the province of Quebec, going to the thousands of work sites to make sure that the conditions of the collective bargaining agreements are enforced. This kind of regime produces some results, and I think some of the more relevant results to what we discuss here right now are those 4. I think it obviously takes the wages out of competition. Professor Hammer talked about John Commons earlier, so I think it does that work pretty well. It's been doing that work pretty well of taking the wages out of the competition. In a way, the same condition applies to every work sites. That's one thing. And on the other side, since all the employers and all the employees are subjected to the same conditions, every one of them has a responsibility and interest in enforcing them, making sure that the competitors are respecting it also. There was also, over the last 40 years, mutualization of the costs and risks, making possible the bargaining of some benefits. So a sectoral pension fund that is administered by the commission, the Construction Commission, which is still partly defined benefit. There's an insurance benefits plan too that's been negotiated for the whole sector. There's an employer-funded vocational training system that was put into place a couple of years ago with a contribution of 20 cents an hour by every employer in the sector. And there's also, which might be the most interesting thing from a Thanks. From a fissured workplace point of view, is that we have in Quebec an employer-funded compensation fund in case of unpaid wages by insolvent or bankrupt employers. So the employers all have to contribute to that fund, and if one closes before he can pay the wages to his workers, we can use these funds to pay up to some level the wages. The CCQ, that is the Construction Commission Inspectorate, is an advantage in that we have multiple unions in Quebec. So the enforcement of the agreements are uniform. Whether you are a CNTU union, CNTU worker or a building trade, international building trade worker, it's the same. And one last highlight that I think it is worth mentioning is that the way that we bargain wages in Quebec allows for a flatter wage structure between the different trades. If we compare to what exists in the rest of Canada, where there is centralized collective bargaining too, but trade-based. What it gives construction workers in Quebec is that the question I tried to answer is that are Quebec's construction workers actually a precarious workforce? Starting from the definition given by Leo Vosco, who defines precarious work as work for remuneration characterized by uncertainty, low income, and limited social benefits and statutory entitlements, which transcends the usual categories of standard and non-standard work. Of course, some construction workers in Quebec are worse off, especially women in Quebec right now, because for many reasons they don't get to benefit from the same advantages that their men colleagues. And it is true that construction jobs are often casual in Quebec as in elsewhere in North America. And there's no possibility of tenure for most of them and no seniority benefits. So non-standard work is the rule, but multi-employer collective bargaining allows for wages that are higher than what we find in most other sectors. I looked at the most recent collective agreements, and even if we take into account the what we call the light residential sector construction, the wages go from $31 to $39 an hour, excluding benefits. So we don't take away money from that. And they have the benefits, the pension fund, and the insurance plans, and vocational training that at levels that are uncommon even among regular full-time employees. And as I said earlier, I think the Act R20, the law in the sector, limits the use of independent contractors, so it limits competition from independent contractors. There are mainly two problems which I will cover very summarily with that kind of system. We have about 150,000 unionized construction workers in Quebec because unionism is mandatory for those workers, and 25,000 employers. And they only bargain once in 4 years, but they do it at the same time. And in a time of neoliberalism, as we have been living for the last 30 years or so, at least in Quebec, it's not looked upon positively from parts of the industry. And having an activity-based system, so types of activities that are covered by the regime, there are a lot of lobbies asking the government to deregulate parts of it. So over the years, we had slow but stable deregulation of the industry, getting union coverage Bon, c'est en 2000.
C'est extraordinaire.
Ouais. If we looked at the NAICS definition, which is larger than what the regime actually covers, we went from 75% of union coverage to 55%. And it's not because less workers join unions, it's because less work is covered by the regime. And that's what has been done in the last 50 years. And that's one threat, especially when we deregulate parts in a way that puts non-union construction contractors in competition with union construction contractors. Which leads to my other point, which is labor conflicts. When they do bargain, and they do so once in 4 years, every 4 years, if they use the leverage they have, it's gonna be seen more widely and attract public attention more than a small workshop. I have the data here from 95 to 2014 because we don't have much data after that from the government. What you can see there is that for most of those years, there's not a single person day lost in construction in Quebec.
It's the blue one?
It's the blue one. But once in a while, bargaining goes badly. And there's a strike. And then they strike, but there are 150,000 of them to do so. So they don't have to strike for long to make the first page of the newspapers. And it attracts the attention of the government. And in these times of labor quiescence, the public opinion is not very tolerant in front of that kind of labor action. So we got in the last years, since 2013, not one, but two back-to-work legislation in Quebec targeting private sector workers. One of the reasons, we're not supposed to say that, but one of the reasons still being the fact that Quebec's government is one of the major clients of the construction industry and doesn't want its own project to be slowed down. That's one of the main problems. So in 2013, 2014, and 2017, back-to-work legislation has been at least threatened in front of the unions. So that's a challenge for free collective bargaining, and that's one consequence of having such a largely structured multi-employer collective bargaining system is that they bargain, a lot of them bargain at the same time, so the strikes will be a disturbance much more than in one workplace at a time. And that's one of the major threats we have to the system right now. It's being reviewed as we speak by the government, and the new government doesn't see this kind of exception in the North American landscape very kindly. So that covers it. Thanks, sir.